Welcome to the first of a 5-part podcast series on this year's book for Visitation Parish, Stranger God by Richard Beck. Today we're going to focus on part 1, which covers the introduction and the first 3 chapters. I'm Lorraine Gordon, a parishioner at Visitation and a member of the Faith Formation team, and with me is Father Patrick Rush, our former pastor who still occasionally celebrates Mass at Visitation. He's graciously agreed to participate in a question and answer format for our series. Father Rush, thank you so much for your willingness to take part in what I think we have to acknowledge is an experiment, since I don't believe Visitation has ever done an unedited podcast series before.
You're welcome, Lorraine. I'm glad to be part of this experience, and I'm especially grateful that the parish has decided to use this book, share this book, Stranger God.
I think I should begin by telling our listeners that one of the main reasons that the Faith Formation team chose this text is that you suggested it to Peg Eckert, who in turn conveyed that recommendation to the team. Would you tell our listeners why you were so taken with this book?
Well, I was taken with the book. Richard Beck, the author, distinguishes between people who are kind to others because they think this is what the way they imitate Christ, what Christ wants of them, and those who share hospitality with others because they meet Christ in the other person. I think I fell into that first category quite a bit, even though I would preach on these scriptures, and it was enlightening to me to hear his distinction. And I especially liked then when he drew out the practicalities of the how-to of all of that, relying on the writing of St. Teresa of Lisieux, whom we know as the Little Flower, who is one of the most popular of the Catholic saints.
Well, in part 1, very definitely, Richard introduces us to this theme of hospitality, as you've mentioned. How do you think most people would define the word, and then how does he sort of redefine it to reflect a Christian dimension?
Well, I think most people would define the word in terms of, say, a Thanksgiving dinner. What it is you provide, what the ambiance is, and the vibrancy of the conversation and so forth. He expands it into reaching out beyond our comfort zone to others, and we meet Christ in our reaching out beyond our comfort zone to others who would not be necessarily invited to our Thanksgiving table, people who are different from ourselves and on the periphery. And this is a constant throughout the Old and New Testament, really, as the importance of hospitality. Israel was an arid climate, and if someone who was a transient couldn't get hospitality, it could be the difference between life and death if he or she was not able to find food or shelter or water. And similarly with the development of the early church between the pagans and the Jews as they all came into the Christian community together.
I think it's important that you mentioned the Thanksgiving dinner, because he talks about the idea of a moral circle, and the moral circle that he describes, we all have a moral circle, and we can use your Thanksgiving dinner as an example of that. These are the people we are comfortable with. These are the people who are similar to us. And yes, we may have some political disagreements, but in general, those are our people, right? Mm-hmm. They look like us, or they talk like us, or they agree with us on a lot of things. And I think what he says is that's a pretty normal inclination for us, to gravitate towards those. But he says, and this is one of the things he says in the book, when we look for and only notice our friends, the people like us, we reduce the territory of our kindness. Hospitality is expanding the moral circle to make room in our hearts for each other, and that other being, as you mentioned, people who are not like us, people who would not necessarily be invited to our table. What did you think of the examples that he used with the 2 waitress scenes?
The 2 waitresses, one that you know and one that you don't know, and both that you receive not the best of service from.
Right.
I think that's very apropos. I cut slack to people who I know, who I have an experience with, a background with, that I don't necessarily cut to somebody who is new to me, and I presume they should fulfill their role.
Right.
And so I think that's a very good, and he does say that this hospitality is really begins in the heart, and there the heart reaches out to the person who is known to us and not necessarily to the person who is unknown to us or foreign to us or somehow off-putting to us.
Right, and I think going back to that waitress scenario. So in one scenario, a group of friends go out, and their one friend has become a waitress, and it's her first night, and she's very she's sort of overwhelmed, and they're sitting down, and she can't get their service to them as quickly, but they're sort of like, oh, no problem, no worries, we know who you are. And then the second scene he offers is where that group of people does not know the waitress, and how they're short with her, and how they're disgruntled, and they don't give her a tip. And it's, again, just that, who do we know, whom do we embrace? And I think that it was a very practical example that I think a lot of us can relate to.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Writing about his own experiences, Richard tells us how, in widening his circle of affection, he discovers Jesus, even though he might not recognize him at first. Does any of the encounters that Richard writes about with what he calls this Jesus in disguise stand out for you?
Well, I think the one that stands out for me is what he calls the Men in White, that biblical study group in prison that he became a part of, going there looking for a deepening relationship with God for himself, and concludes that he's meeting God in these people. And I know that I have that experience when people come to me with difficulties. I often meet Christ in the way in which, in the faith with which they address their own challenges. And I think all of us probably have those kinds of experience where the other person dealing with a difficult situation really increases our own faith. And this is what happened to him with those men in white in the prison, that biblical study group.
Right. I like the example where he and his wife are invited over to Robert and Judy's apartment. And Robert and Judy are members of the same congregation that Richard and his wife belong to. And Richard admits he's kind of OCD about, like, dirt, and he knows that if he goes into Robert's apartment, there's going to be pet fur, and there's going to be odor, and HUD has actually, threatened them a few times, and so he's not really excited about going in there. But it's just before it's December, and Richard says, "Okay, I'll come in," and he goes in, and Robert takes him upstairs, and Robert has put together this extraordinarily beautiful canopy of Christmas lights and Christmas ornaments, and he turns it on, and he turns to Richard and says, "Merry Christmas." And Richard is just overwhelmed. It's just such a beautiful small thing, and he had to sort of overcome the resistance in him to, to just drop them off and say, "Well, another time, I'll see you later," knowing, of course, that he doesn't really want to walk up those stairs. He really doesn't want to smell all those animal smells. And he has this just sort of moment, this little epiphany. And I think he's talking about those kind of moments too, where we make time.
I do. I think right there is the disguise that oftentimes keeps us from recognizing Christ. Because what I liked about that story was how those are aspects of the living situation of that couple that would be off-putting to any of us. Right. The smell, the environment, the messiness, whatever. And oftentimes, we use that as the demarcation for our circle of concern and love. Those are not people that we're comfortable with, therefore those are not people we associate with a sense of concern and love.
Right, and going back to the example that you liked, Men in White, he talks about how his idea was to bring God to them because he had a ministerial vocation. And he ends up saying, "I didn't bring God out to prison. God was already there, waiting for me, a stranger God than I could have imagined, a God who embraced me in the tattooed arms of prisoners." Mm-hmm. So I think that's such a compelling way to sort of, you don't think of God, of Christ having tattooed arms, but yeah. And then he also says that hospitality is opening the door to let Jesus in, and I think he refers at some point to a passage in Revelations where Jesus is knocking at a door, and it's kind of like he's waiting for us to open the door and walk through it. So I thought that was really a good passage. Richard often refers to the story of Abraham being visited by the three angelic strangers. I believe that's in Genesis. And that was the very passage from the Hebrew Torah that the worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh were reading and discussing when they were shot and killed. And I just wondered if you thought Richard's message about Abraham related at all to that event.
Well, I think that I don't know how it related to that event, to be totally honest with you, but certainly that's a classic example of the need for hospitality and how it is that Christ, in that event, the strangers predict that Abraham's wife, Sarah, who has been, the couple has not been able to have children, that she will be pregnant by that same time next year. Sarah laughs to where the strangers can hear that laugh. And they kind of point that out to her, but say, you will be pregnant. And she is. So the grace of God comes to them in that situation, and they really weren't even expecting that.
Yeah, I think, the way I sort of read that was that Abraham was about to prepare a meal for himself and his wife, and these three strangers appear. And I think Genesis makes a point that they're angelic, and so they can be, I think, in Orthodox Christianity, they're actually seen as manifestations of God. And the idea is that God is welcomed by extending hospitality to strangers, which you also have, sort of as a major theme in this book. And I guess when I heard the news, that they were reading that very passage about the three angelic strangers and the hospitality that Abraham had shown them, I didn't go as far as you did, Father Pat, with, remembering about Sarah, but I just thought, this is a congregation that has historically, been comprised of people who were considered strangers. And here they were reading about the blessedness of hospitality. They were also a congregation who supported an organization that the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which aids and supports refugees. And while I think the shooter thought that they were bringing in the stranger as Jews, actually 90% of what the HIAS does are taking people who are not Jewish. So I just thought it was just painfully ironic that that's what they were reading and celebrating when this person, who was kind of the extreme example of suspicion of the stranger, walks in and literally, in the most extreme act, eradicates any kind of hope for hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this reference to Abraham brings up another question. Whether it's the story of Abraham and the strangers, or the Holy Family in flight being taken in by Egyptians, or early church members being admonished for not being hospitable to specific converts, I was surprised to learn how central a theme hospitality to the stranger is in both the Old and New Testament. Do you feel that priority has been emphasized by the preaching and practice of the Catholic Church?
I don't know that it's central to the preaching and practice of the Catholic Church. We certainly have documents on immigration and welcoming the immigrant. We have organizations, Don Bosco Center here in Kansas City, that does welcome the immigrants. It's a Catholic-sponsored center. Visitation Parish worries about being hospitable. The people of Visitation worry about being welcoming to new members. And I often get from new members, either they did feel welcomed or they didn't feel welcome. Most often the first, not the second. But I do think that there is this strain of our own value system that it makes welcoming the person important. Now, others will go on to say, the Catholic Church has closed communion, non-members don't come to communion, that's not welcoming. Well, that could be debated at other points, but I do think there is a sense of welcoming and outreach in the RCIA and others to our faith.
Well, I think, that hospitality I've just never heard that word stressed so much, and I've been in Catholic schools from grade school through graduate school, and I never really heard that focus. I mean, I know that there are works of mercy and etc., but it was more like, as you said earlier, starting out, that it was we were acting like Christ when we did something,
yes,
as opposed to doing something so that we would discover Christ. That, as for me, was also a totally new dimension. And then finally, I guess one of the things I wanted to see how you felt about was one scene that he calls up from the Gospel of Mark is the one that I was really touched by, and that is Jesus curing the leper. How do you think the sequence of actions that Jesus takes towards the leper is a model for hospitality? Because Richard certainly does think that.
Well, Jesus doesn't seem to be put off by the leprosy. Again, he sees beyond what might be off-putting to another and welcomes the person. And he allows him to come close to him. He reaches out and touches him. And you brought up the issue of the gunning down in the Jewish synagogue in Pittsburgh. One of those who was killed, a physician, I understand, very deliberately would not use gloves when he was treating HIV patients. And he didn't want the other person to feel that he in any way was afraid of him and didn't welcome him. There are those kinds of small gestures that I'm sure he didn't have Jesus and the leper in mind, but in fact he was imitating Jesus in that story from St. Mark's Gospel.
Yeah, and I see the leper as sort of a universal symbol of anyone who, for very obvious reasons, is not someone you want to physically embrace, and he's not even supposed to be close to Jesus. He is. The lepers were to yell "unclean, unclean" so that people got out of their way. The fact that he's even close to Jesus would suggest that that's sort of an unusual situation, and the fact that Jesus touches him before he says that you're clean. Again, it's just the willingness to that's such a beautiful gesture. And what I think Richard does with this is really interesting, which is, he says the embrace came first, followed by the cleansing, and we should ponder that significance. And what he does is he actually becomes kind of critical of churches who generally, what they do with the sinful or the unclean or whatever, kind of label you want to give them is clean up your act first and then we'll embrace you. And he says, no, that's the wrong order. You embrace and then you have a discussion of what it is that seems to be a moral concern. So I thought that was really, really compelling. Well, I want to thank you again, Father Pat, and for today's conversation. And we've sort of come to a point where I'd like to pose a few questions for our listeners, and they're really Richard's questions. And I'm just going to read a couple of lines. Our response to the call of hospitality is to answer some simple questions. Who are the people on the periphery of my life? Who is that person at the far boundaries of my care and attention? Who is being ignored in my workplace and in my church? Who is being marginalized in my neighborhood and my nation? Who would Jesus grab to place at the center of my attention? So we've come to the conclusion of our first podcast on Stranger God, and we hope you'll join us for the second in the series of 5. It will be available next week. Once again, I want to thank Father Pat for both recommending the book and for participating in today's conversation, and for Teresa Albright, who has made all this happen today. The Faith Formation team would love your feedback on this and other podcasts, so feel free to leave a comment. We also hope these podcasts might inspire you to attend our book discussions on A Stranger God that will occur later this winter. Thank you so much for listening today.